we looked at our first four-wall line dance, the Hully Gully, that was created, do you remember, in 1959 and started to take off in 1960. Another dance in 1959 and then 1960 made a bigger splash and would change the look of social dancing for the remainder of that decade, the 60s and beyond. It was the twist, and the step itself had been around teen dancing since the mid-1950s and was slowly becoming more popular among teenagers. But it was still under the radar, so to speak, at that time. Hank Ballard saw teens dancing it in Florida, and he wrote the song, The Twist, in 1959. But it was released on the B-side of one of his singles without much notice at all. Dick Clark also saw teens dancing it on his American Bandstand show, and he saw the potential of a bigger hit. So he recommended to Cameo Records that Chubby Checker re-record the song, which they did. And The Twist became the #1 hit in 1960. And two dynamics influenced the popularity of The Twist. The disenfranchised teenagers, remember, they were being ignored. They were looking for some validation of something they consider their own, apart from their parents' generation. And The Twist was their own creation, and it had just hit #1 on the charts. And then second motivation here for this version, many white parents were worried about their daughter admiring Black musicians with fears of racial commingling, and Hank Ballard was considered sexy. But his original version of The Twist, that was hardly noticed. Chubby Checker, he was seen as wholesome, which is why Dick Clark recommended him. You know, the joke at the time was that Chubby Checker was more of a threat to your refrigerator than to your daughter. I remember that joke back then. So this time, most grown-ups didn't protest the latest teen fad. The teenagers had actually been drifting apart just a little bit into solo dancing throughout the 1950s with their bop step, it was kind of a solo step, and bandstand style swing, which was occasionally a part, and they had a separated version of cha-cha that was called calypso. So now The Twist just finalized that break from closed dance position. The twist was actually only briefly fashionable among teenagers, then it died for them. What killed it? Grown-ups fell in love with the twist, partially because it was easy and it made them feel young and trendy. Let's do the twist for adults, that says. And that was 2 years later. That was 1962. Chubby Checker's record, that hit #1 again for the second time that year. It was now danced by the sophisticated crowd at the Peppermint Lounge in New York City, and the Arthur Murray Studios featured it. And of course, then it was no longer cool in the eyes of the teenagers. So they moved on to other dance fads. But significantly, almost all of those other new fads were also dance solo. The frug, the mashed potato, that was essentially a modified Charleston step, the swim, the Watusi, the monkey, the pony, the locomotion, the Freddy, and dozens more. Here's a joke on the cover of 13 magazine. Can you read that? Yes? Yeah. So for the majority of the public, solo dancing in place, facing your partner, has been the continued social dance tradition since then. For some of them, but some teens at that time did continue the swing dance tradition. You can see them dancing swing in the background of the recorded 1960s American Bandstand shows. And on YouTube today, you can also see that Bandstand still had occasional swing contests in the 1960s. So it didn't die out, but partner dancing had fallen into a distant second place behind solo dancing. And the twist was not the only thing that negatively impacted closed couple partner dancing at that time. What was the other one? Feminism and the new 1960s counterculture. Both considered traditional partner dancing to be out of date, partially because their parents were doing it, and partially because of some of the sexist manifestations of the dark ages of ballroom dance from the 1920s, 30s that were still widespread at that time. So rather than trying to evolve social dance into a less sexist and demeaning version, most of them rejected the entire tradition. You're not going to lead me anywhere, Buster. So now I want to clarify that I'm talking about the mainstream trend, because at that time, some social dancers, and in fact, many social dancers, saw the value of partner dancing, and they started to find ways to evolve the form forward, eliminating the idea that lead means command and follow means obey. Not anymore. In the 60s, counterculture and feminism finally provided the necessary incentive to start reshaping partnered social dance. Or I should say, returning partner dancing to its original ideals. Remember in the 19th century, the ideals of mutual respect and generosity and kindness. That had been the original way. They were just bringing it back, resetting it to that. Now, one significant population that continued the 1950s style of swing dancing were the Hispanic kids, largely Puerto Rican and Cuban, in New York City. Partner dancing was a strong part of their culture, and the boys still considered couple dancing to be masculine. So they continued the style, you might say bandstand style, of swing, as was done when the twist came along. So why was this demographic significant? Well, you already know from our dance classes, but the full story is interesting. Disco. Rarely does a dance movement fit so precisely within a decade, exactly those years. 70s disco was born on Valentine's Day, 1970, about half a century ago, when David Manusco opened the Loft in New York City, and it rapidly faded in 1980. Now, as I mentioned last Wednesday, your source for this tale, me, has had firsthand experience. I worked as a media and club designer for a large network of discos, and that was New York, Boston, Fort Lauderdale, Buffalo, New York, Cincinnati, Minneapolis, and Houston in the 70s. From before Saturday Night Fever launched the disco fad until after it all subsided. So I traveled to all of those clubs and I participated in these huge New York City disco conventions. And record companies sent me their latest disco recordings as soon as they were released. So I had a chance to see all of the phases of the disco craze firsthand. And here is the story. When the disco movement peaked, that was at the end of the decade, 1978 and 79, the demographic, who was going there? That was predominantly white, heterosexual, urban and suburban middle class. But it did not begin that way. For the first 8 years, disco was an underground movement. And then the film Saturday Night Fever, December 1977, turned this simmering subculture into a mainstream fad, resulting in a 30-fold increase in disco clubs. So who went to discos and why? Well, there was not one definitive disco demographic, because the 70s saw the emergence of today's pluralism, where individual variety and interests and tastes, that individualism surpasses any mass trends or fads. And thus, several different populations were attracted to the disco scene. One population was the generation of younger baby boomers who felt left out of the 60s counterculture revolution. They were teens during the 60s, perhaps college students, but they were bystanders, watching the events from the sidelines. Many were wistfully envious of the expanding freedoms which they saw the hippies create, from personal evolution and quest for enlightenment to the sexual revolution, especially the sexual revolution. As Bruce Pollock recalled in 1979, we had been reminded once too often that we were just not with it. While they had long hair and Woodstock, we had nothing to clearly call our own. We needed a kind of shared activity scorned by our elders, which would bring us together as a group. At the disco, we have forged a generational banner. It's great to feel special at last, close quote. So for a significant population of boomers, the 70s were their turn. So with the price of admission to a disco, they could safely purchase a taste of the freedoms which they had only watched during the 60s. But they adopted a wholly different aesthetic from the counterculture, because an important part of feeling special is being different. In this case, different from the hippies. A core element of the new disco scene was sophistication. This meant upscale. This meant classy, but keeping the counterculture emphasis on becoming personally evolved. Sophistication was also defined by what it was not. It wasn't rustic country life. It wasn't dressing down. So the sexual liberation pioneered in the 60s, that was embraced, but as a glamorous urban version. And there was another reason for the change in aesthetics. By that, I mean like the disco look, beyond change for change's sake. And this involved a second disco population, the suburban middle class, the blue collar working class. And here we find the same upward mobility that has motivated the middle classes for 2 centuries now. Disco was appealing because its sophistication was a step up for them, but still within reach. All they had to do was dress up and pay the admission, and they could live in an elegant and futuristic world for a night, and hopefully mingle with people a step higher on the social ladder. And then disco music mirrored this sophistication, featuring orchestras. That was the Philadelphia sound, with large string and brass sections, quite the opposite of small, hard-hitting rock bands. And it was intentionally opposite. So for the middle and working class young Americans, the possibility of taking a step up in their lives, it was more compelling than dressing down. And that is essentially the story of Saturday Night Fever, the working class Italian American who was a hardware clerk by day and a disco king by night. Significantly, the discos also offer a taste of freedom and self-actualization for 3 other subcultures during the 70s: gays, Hispanics, and African Americans. After decades of marginalization or persecution for each of these minorities, they all found a supportive home in the discos. Gays were the first, right from the beginning, when David Minusco opened the Loft, closely followed by the Sanctuary and the Paradise Garage, all in New York City, all in 1970. And after the countercultural revolution of the 60s, there was now a relatively wider acceptance of gays in the media, followed by some legal freedoms in New York City in 1971. Bill Bernstein, a photographer at the Studio 54 Disco Club, recalled, "Disco was a haven for inclusion and acceptance. The street wasn't. Out on the street, homophobia existed much more than today. Transgenders took their life in their hands walking down the street in New York City. But as soon as they stepped foot into a disco, they were safe. Not only were they safe, they were included. They were accepted. They were a part of the scene." Journalist Bob Colicello, he noted that the beautiful models would go to the gay clubs with their designers and hairdressers and makeup men, and then the straight guys would want to meet the models, so they would go to these clubs, and then it all started blending, close quote. So what was dance there? When the disco scene erupted in 1970, at the beginning, partner dancing was revived, with the disco dancers adopting, as I mentioned, the local teen style of swing kept alive by New York Latinos during the 60s, like at the St. Mary's Church dances that was in the Bronx and elsewhere in New York. The term Latin hustle, therefore, refers to the New York Hispanics who were still dancing this way, not because it's imported from any Latin American country. It's not. The structure, step patterns, and the figures of disco hustle are all essentially the same as 1950s American teen jitterbug, as we're doing today in class. And this had been mothballed for almost a decade, but it had been kept alive by the Hispanic dancers in New York City and some others who were really great at partner dancing. But it was done in a new way of moving, this more upright walking style we were doing today. You might say a strutting style. It gave this form of swing an entirely different look and feeling. And then now, how about music and discos? If you were transported back to an early 70s disco, let's say 1972, you might be surprised to hear only pop music and soul and Motown music from the 60s. But then, A new sound hit New York in 1973, imported from Africa, not African-American, but Africa, the Soul Mokasa single by Manu Dibango, which charged Manhattan disco scene with a new energy. It was stunningly unlike anything else at the time. It was a repetitious motif with no melody line, no story in the lyrics, and with a steady dance beat. Mama ku mama sa makumakusa mama ku mama sa makumakusa mama ku mama sa makumakusa mama ku mama sa mamakusa. So they might not sound like disco because we've heard what came after that. That idea much stronger and hard hitting, but at that time it was an overwhelmingly and strikingly new sound. All right, so then we next had, the next level was these orchestras, the larger Philly sound orchestral version with funky rhythms, and then the next generation of Motown soul, all of which were primarily African-American. So combined together, this became the definitive sound of the disco era. So normally we don't want to oversimplify things, but one could say that the original disco subculture from 1970 to 1977, that underground scene, you could say that was a fusion of the gay urban party scene, partner dancing kept alive by the Latinos, and African-American music. And then once the ball was rolling, many other populations of Americans were also attracted to the discos for a wide variety of reasons with all of these different demographics. And then from there, disco quickly spread to Europe and actually to parts of Asia. I went to discos in Tokyo in the 70s. So new freedoms were expressed on the dance floor. This could be the self-expression of solo dancing or the many shades of the sexual revolution played out in partner dancing, but dressed up with disco fashions, which also emphasize sexuality, and accompanied by overtly sexual lyrics in the new music, songs celebrating macho men and foxy ladies and love machines and doing it, that kind of thing. The journalist Bob Colicello said, in the 70s, there was a window of opportunity between the invention of the birth control pill and the advent of AIDS. So even if you weren't sleeping with someone, you felt like you could. Love was in the air, close quote. Now, like most fads, disco is also a way to be modern. But beyond modern, this one was futuristic. And that was a major element of the disco scene. Everything was state of the art. From the latest look in club design, that's what I was doing, to all new fashions. Yes, all new synthetic polyester fabrics. That had never been seen before. And electronic synthesized dance music that entered the disco scene in the late 70s as the perfect match for these state-of-the-art sound systems. And those sound systems were actually better than today because it had a hanging array of super tweeters just above your head, just out of reach, above mammoth subwoofers. They were the size of minivans all around the edges. Those two together made an amazing sound. It was present and boomy. And that was illuminated with the highest tech lighting, lasers, fog machines, computerized multimedia visuals. That was my job then. Animated neon flickering around. We were all having these meetings about those multicolored lasers. What if they got in an eyeball? But they were popular. So to quote Steve D'Acquisto, he said, it was like a cross between outer space and a big playhouse. And the dancers felt that the disco was a movement that they created. But that was still the original disco scene that I'm talking about, that cultural movement that they felt was uniquely theirs. That was before it became a fad. The underground phase actually lasted a fairly long time for a fad, 8 years, much longer than the 2 years second phase after Saturday Night Fever launched the Discomania. And that's when the number of dance clubs exploded from 1,500 to 45,000 in 2 years. Both partnered and solo dancing were done throughout the disco era, but you might find this interesting. The proportions changed dramatically in 1978. During the first 8 years, what did you see? Disco dancing was primarily partner dancing, like you see here. That was the living tradition of swing. To quote Maria Torres, a disco dancer from New York City, she said, "The thing which really killed partner dancing was Saturday Night Fever. Disco was originally an underground dance done mainly by Hispanics, Blacks, and gays who could really do partner dancing. They were incredible, but that was an underground thing. Then, when Saturday Night Fever came out, the masses flocked to the clubs to see the experience that they saw in the movie. But what they thought the hustle was, they thought it was freestyle solo because that's what John Travolta did. Yep, partnering hustle did continue after that, absolutely, but it was a little bit overshadowed by freestyle solo dancing like the 1960s in the final 2 years of the disco craze. So here's how it happened. The original script for Saturday Night Fever called for only partner dancing that was actually done at the 2001 Odyssey Club in the story. This was originally a magazine article about that club, then it became the script for this movie. But John Travolta felt that a solo dance would better develop the character arc of a storyline. And he insisted that the script be changed to feature him doing solo freestyle dancing. In an interview that I found, Travolta said, "I had to enforce that scene. They were basing this movie on his being the best dancer, and he didn't have a solo. I had to prove to the audience that he was the best." Little did he know that his added scene would actually change the dynamic of disco dancing. Another reason for the later increase in freestyle solo dancing was the shift in focus to heavier drinking during the disco fever years. 44,000 new disco clubs sprouted up in 1 year, partially because liquor sales were so profitable. And clubs devised new ways to encourage drinking. And as I mentioned in the class on Monday, partner dancing requires considerable and fairly sober skills, while freestyle dancing could be done while intoxicated. And so could line dancing. After not really being noticed so much in this country during the 1960s, line dancing finally took off in the 1970s in the discos. And in the next craze after that, 1980s, that was country western. The 5-part Hully Gully simplified into the 4-part Hot Chocolate. And the bus stop, which some of you also might know from Jamix, that was the biggest disco line dance hit. But there was also the Night Fever line dance, the roller coaster, disco duck, and more. But partnered hustle remained the focus of more than 85 how-to disco books that were published at the time. I think I have all of them. And what was really danced? Well, virtually every disco how-to dance book and the dance studios taught in step patterns, carefully fitting each figure into 4 or 6 or 8 counts. But on the actual dance floors, and I was there, many dancers simply walked and strutted through swing figures without a specific timing or without specific patterns, just occasionally adding flourishes such as taps and kicks and rock steps and swivels and poses. So both were done. Specific step timings like the Latin hustle, those were done, but also simple walking, ornamented by footwork flourishes and poses. In 1979, the disco mania grew even larger, and it permeated throughout popular culture. It seems that everyone was now recording disco music, including Disney and the Muppets and Arthur Fiedler and the Boston Pops, even 72-year-old Ethel Merman. It was the cover story of Newsweek, Time, and Life magazine, even Mad magazine. Advertisers had a new large target audiences, many ads about disco. TV shows added disco themes, Chips here. There was also Disco Snoopy. Here we have Disco Barbie with her disco record player. I have that one here. Lunchboxes, yep, I've got those. Disco was huge. So now, does it seem odd that over 1 million white, straight, middle-class suburban Americans flocked to discos that they knew were initially gay, Black, and Latino scenes? And no, it wasn't odd because a core element of the disco scene was sophistication. Sophistication meant wanting to see oneself as personally evolved. The message of the 1960s countercultural revolution had received endless press coverage. Everybody knew about it, propagated in hundreds of popular songs, and glamorized in dozens of films. So by 1976, it had trickled down to the working class. Rural bigotry was now seen as unsophisticated, as harshly depicted in the 1972 film Deliverance. The term homophobia, that was coined in this decade, around 1970, and was pejorative. Both the suburban and the blue collar kids like to see themselves as evolving beyond that. 70s disco dancers may have been criticized at the time for the pursuit of superficial pleasures, but it was also a time of acceptance of otherness, more so than would be seen in the following decades. And I cannot emphasize the significance of this enough today. The formerly marginalized or ostracized demographics of Blacks and Hispanics and gays, they all found a welcoming, inclusive community in the discos. Nile Rodgers, a Black musician, said, "For me, a New Yorker, I'm telling you, this was revolutionary. It was the first time that it felt like people were non-judgmental. Everyone was fine with everyone else," close quote. So the straight white population at the discos, they welcomed this inclusivity just as much. They had evolved a step up and they knew it. And they were proud to be a part of this family. No other time in the history of the United States, before or since, was as accepting of otherness as this decade was. And to this day, the 70s serve as an example of what is possible. People not only tolerating otherness, but embracing it as the best way to be. And hopefully that era showed what might be possible again. Yeah, I know, looking at the situation today, I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic, but we saw that it's possible.